Bună ziua și bine v-am găsit la o nouă ediție a interviurilor RoZoom Press. Astăzi vom discuta cu un prieten drag, jurnalist, James Melville, este manager director la o firmă de consultanță comunicare, West, cu sedii la Cornwall, Londra și în Scoția. Este și jurnalist și colaborează cu Al Jazeera și Byline Times. Este, printre altele, și unul dintre cei mai importanți influenceri în Marea Britanie, cu peste 1 miliard de interacțiuni pe an pe Twitter și peste 163.000 de followers. Dar motivul pentru care l-am invitat cu noi astăzi este pentru că a scris foarte mult despre strategiile pe care le-au adoptat celelalte țări în relația pentru a înfrunta coronavirus. Este foarte interesant și să putem înțelege cum s-a comportat Marea Britanie, care pentru o bună bucată de vreme a fost luată drept un model de către România. Interviul va fi făcut în limba engleză și veți avea subtitrare, deci de acum trecem în limba engleză. So, James, thank you very much for joining us and welcome.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Now, James, you have written several times on the strategies to deal with coronavirus around the world, criticizing the UK's government on the actions that they have taken to tackle the pandemics. We know now that the UK has the highest death number within Europe and the second within the whole world. But my first question is, according to you, what were the UK's government mistakes in dealing with this crisis?
I think the major problem comes right at the start, where the UK were given prior warning because of the patterns of the spread of the virus in Asia and then in Italy and Spain and France. But they didn't take notice in terms of implementing the right response. The right response would have been an early lockdown with almost immediate effect after the first cases. Countries that have displayed that in terms of response, such as New Zealand, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Denmark, who locked down within days of getting their first cases, have now come out the other side with restricted numbers of cases and a lower death rate compared to a lot of countries. The UK waited 7 weeks to lock down after its first case. The first case was on January the 29th. The UK locked down on the 22nd and 23rd of March. Within that time, there was major sporting events for spectators. The pubs and restaurants, cinemas, theatres were all still open, and the disease was already spreading. So the main reason why the UK has got a huge number of cases and death rates in comparison to other countries is because of that delayed response, in particular to the lockdown. That is also then backed up by a logistical issue on facilities, in particular the lack of PPE and protective equipment cover in our care homes and our hospitals, but also a slow response of a joined up program of testing, tracking and tracing. The countries that have put all those elements together, like the examples I mentioned in Denmark and in countries in Asia, in particular South Korea and Vietnam and Taiwan and New Zealand, are the ones who are now walking out the other side of this virus and opening up their society again. And it's the reason why the UK is still not in a position to do that.
Yeah, I have seen yesterday a report from, the statements of Professor Neil Ferguson, which was the beginning in the express commission of the UK government. And he said if the lockdown had been introduced earlier, like 2 weeks earlier, half of those deaths could have been avoided. So, and he was like saying something about 25,000 deaths. And it's a shocking number. And what I'm asking is, if the report turns out, if this statement turns out to be correct, will someone be held accountable for these deaths, or it will remain business as usual?
I think the accountability and holding an individual or individuals to account has to come at the government because they're setting a policy. They're obviously acting on their own advice, but they did have the opportunity to look at the patterns that were already emerging in Asia and in parts of Europe before then, to see what was successful and what wasn't successful. They could see in front of them that the delay in Italy, for instance, and in Spain, and to an extent France, was causing these huge patterns of cases and deaths. But they also could see the patterns of Asia again, where the countries who got on top of it quickly, like Vietnam and Taiwan, were restricting, they were nipping it in the bud. So the simple premise of early lockdown means it's impossible for the virus to then spread in huge numbers. And it means you come out of lockdown and open up your society much quicker because you've restricted the numbers. So in terms of from start to finish, whether it's the lack of PPE, the lack of testing and tracing, no early lockdowns, and mixed messages as well in terms of what the public should do, that responsibility falls completely on the British government.
And will be held accountable at a certain point, in your opinion?
Well, it'll come out in inquiry. I mean, a lot of the UK media are holding them to account. The public are confused. But at some point, when the dust settles on this, there will be I presume, a public inquiry where we'll go into this in a lot more detail. But fundamentally, the decisions and the impacts of those decisions, the responsibility lies with the government, and therefore the scrutiny has to be aimed in the direction of the government.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And another aspect another thing that I've noticed was that the lockdown that has been imposed in the end was a lot milder than that imposed into Italy or Romania, because I have still friends back in Italy, and I have my parents in Romania, and there was like really a strict lockdown imposed there. Here I kind of sensed more recommendations than actual mandatory rules. Why is that? I mean, it is enough in the UK system as to just make a recommendation, or we have to actually do something that it's really mandatory. I mean, back in Romania, we have seen military orders at that point, and it's a country from the EU, not a dictatorship or something.
I think this adds to the confusion. So while there's a lockdown, albeit the lockdown's easing now, the first month of the lockdown was that whole stay at home, stay safe, be alert premise. But then it's contradicted by the fact that Britain was one of the last countries in the world to have any form of testing and quarantining program at their airports. Up to 2 or 3 weeks ago, 100,000 passengers were arriving in UK airports, and none of them were tested and quarantined. I think I read somewhere a couple of weeks ago that Britain and Jordan were the only 2 countries that didn't do that. So you have that particular issue, combined with the fact that representatives of the government or politicians have been breaking their own rules that they set, combined with the fact that, in bank holidays, the beaches have been full. There's been obviously the protests recently. So while the government have been saying things, some of their policies are inconsistent. So there's an inconsistent approach to, can you go and see loved ones? If so, how long? You couldn't stay overnight at other family members who might not be in your house or friends, but you could meet up with them in a park or supermarket. So I think, as well as all the things I've mentioned before about no early lockdown, a lack of PPE, the government haven't been particularly clear or consistent about the guidelines they want their own country to fulfill. I think in the first few weeks, the public almost took it upon themselves to follow the guidelines that were in front of them. And certainly now I get a sense, 2 or 3 months on, people are being a lot more relaxed in terms of how they approach the lockdown on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it was like kind of confusing for everybody to see what was happening. And right now it's kind of strange that they did impose a quarantine for those entering the UK, while they didn't impose it at the beginning, where it had more sense, according to, at least in my opinion. It's what other countries in the European Union have done.
I think that's it. The simple thing is that the results tell its own story. The countries that operated a policy of immediate lockdowns, combined with a good testing and tracking program and isolation within that, combined with a very aggressive approach to shutting down borders, they're the ones that have managed to curb the spread of the virus, and thankfully for them, with low fatalities. The UK has largely not done any of those things. And so that helps explain why the numbers are significantly higher.
Yeah, as far as I could have understood from, the government statements and press conferences, the worries were connected with the economy. Just not stop the economy, even though we see that the effects will be like a lot more dramatic than we could expect. And another, something that doesn't, make sense to me at least, is the fact that they said in the beginning that, mass testing and tracing was highly expensive, but doesn't cost much more during a lockdown at a certain point anyway. And,
I think basically, again, if you look at a compare and contrast approach with Germany, with Germany, there's often commented that Germany have got, there's evidence that they had more cases than Britain. But the only reason the Germans knew they had more cases is because they were testing more. The Germans had in place a testing program where hundreds of thousands of people were getting tested on an almost by a per day basis, right at the start of this, with a tracing program. Then community initiatives where local GPs were in a thing called corona taxis and going out to houses in their community and testing people even on mild symptoms, and using their spare capacity of ICU beds and beds in hospitals to treat people who even had moderate or mild symptoms. So all that bundled together explains why their death rate is low compared to the amount of cases that they've had. Again, the UK didn't have the infrastructures in place to get the same results. So while one aspect of the lockdown was too late, there's also additional issues with, the lack of PPE, the lack of an effective tracing program until it was too late. Testing that was to begin with largest around the severely ill in hospitals, but not actually in the wider community. So on all of these components, there was no integrated approach at all from the UK compared to many other countries in Europe, in Asia, and in Australasia as well.
Well, as a foreign observer, I kind of had the sense, even if the UK's government has denied, that it was like herd immunity applied at the beginning, at least. Am I wrong on that? I mean, yeah, they did deny that was the strategy, but in the end of the day, the actions were like towards that direction. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a period in the beginning, through the March basically up to the lockdown, where there was open discussions where Boris Johnson appeared on a daytime TV program and half jokingly said, well, there might be an argument for British people to take it on the chin, as he said, and herd immunity was mentioned. But I think they reined in on that because a lot of the evidence that was appearing, like from Imperial College and so on, was that if they did that, then worst case scenario, between 400 and 500,000 people would die. And so they then altered that and moved towards the lockdown approach. But in the process of pivoting positions, they wasted 2 to 3 weeks. So while Ferguson was saying that, 1 week earlier, 25,000, I would argue that based on all the other countries, where many countries were locking down within a few days of the first case, the UK in total wasted 7 weeks. Now, that would have had a profound impact on the lowering of the cases and the deaths if the UK's first case on the 29th of January, if they had locked down, say, the first week of February, we'd be in a very, very different position right now.
Yeah, it seemed to me like, gambling on the entire population. The report that the government presented last week, said also that a huge, shocking amount of deaths are within the same communities. So my question is, why is that? I mean, what is happening?
I mean, I think that's a lot of the evidence and the reasons for that will still have to come out. I mean, I think you're looking at communities it's different. I mean, I think there's communities in different countries who've been affected in different ways. So, for instance, in Italy, there's an argument to be had that one of the reasons their figures were higher is a high elderly population and multi-generational families all living in the same house, same patterns in Spain. I think the figures in the UK are, I mean, possibly one reason could be that London's been severely affected by this virus, as has Birmingham, two major cities in the UK, of which is a higher percentage of ethnic minority population within those cities. So that then goes to explain why, you know, the figures are slightly higher within those groups, because, you know, they've got a propensity to live in those two major cities.
So you don't think it has to do with mainly with you know, social inequalities, or with the fact that more of these communities are in the forefront line as you know, essential workers?
I think that is something that, when it gets to the inquiry stage, that will be something that will be looked at. I think there's definitely an argument that could be a factor. But then you could argue the other way as well, that there's many places in other countries where, you know, whether it's ethnic minorities, people living in more disadvantaged, poverty-based communities and areas haven't been affected. So the virus in certain countries, like for instance, in Greece is a perfect example, whereby they have come off the back of a 10-year austerity program after a huge financial crash, where their healthcare systems were severely affected by a program of austerity. And they were obviously concerned that they would have the same pattern as Italy. But what they did to alleviate that was they locked down immediately again. And it's had incredible results. The death rate in Greece is I think it's still under 200, which is an extraordinary set of results compared to what's going on around them. So you've got a lot of individuals in different countries who might be trapped in poverty, but not necessarily affected. So therefore, you've got to look slightly further than that. You've got to look about, it goes back to the start, that if the UK government had put the right measures in place in terms of early lockdowns, then they'd be protecting not just ethnic minority communities, but communities at large. You know, there's clusters of the cases and the deaths that's springing up in different areas of the country. But inevitably, the areas that are of higher density population are the ones that have been more at risk. And so that goes part of the reason to explain why in those higher density populated areas, such as Birmingham and London, with a higher percentage of ethnic minority groups, their numbers are in particular slightly higher in those areas.
Yeah, another thing that you know, just like hit me during the lockdown was that several construction sites were still open, and that is not essential workers. So there was like within the legislation that has been applied for the lockdown, some lacks that didn't also cover this, and of course with no protection back then, because the recommendations on wearing masks and so on, actually it became mandatory from 15. I mean, it is still not mandatory to use masks, not even in the public transport, which is like,
well, that's it again, everything was too late. You know, even within the lockdown, there wasn't any sort of enforcement of masks. There wasn't the cover in care homes. You know, there was even an issue right at the start, people sort of forget this now, of, you know, whether there's going to be enough ventilator supply in hospitals. The simple conclusion with all of this, I think, is that from start to finish, the UK government squandered the time they had to prepare for this. This virus was out 2 or 3 months, possibly earlier, in Asia. They didn't look at the patterns there. They didn't even look at the patterns that are emerging in Italy. They still didn't do anything. Whether that is in terms of, you know.
hello.
Can you? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just a second.
Yeah, you just disappeared.
Yeah. So the patterns of both facilities, protection, and lockdown were largely ignored by the UK. And that includes even things like not just hospital workers and care homes, but protection for shop workers, for the police, for bus drivers, for train drivers. All of this stuff is largely ignored, and therefore heightened the risk within all of those workers, the key workers basically, of getting infected.
Nobody cared in the end of the day.
I think they cared, but they were negligent. They were inept in the response, that everything was done too late. I mean, I have a great phrase with all of this, that the countries that showed foresight are the ones that are coming out of this quicker. But the UK is operating on hindsight. They're looking backwards. And there's still, I mean, for instance, there's recent reports about to have a fully national program of contact tracing, which is an essential part to monitor where we go forward in all of this. They're now saying that might not be rolled out till the end of September.
Yeah, and most probably. You know very well the international politics. If we look to the major, let's call them populist leaders, I mean Trump, Bolsonaro here, Boris Johnson, and also Putin. I mean, all of them kind of underestimate the danger, and right now they do face really huge problems. So why is that? What in your opinion, of course, did they think that they can just like get away with that, or that the virus will fear them, or what?
I think there's a pattern. If you look at some of the most progressive governments, New Zealand, Germany, Norway, Denmark, Argentina, these governments were on top of it, and they all developed slightly different policies, but there's a consistent theme over early lockdowns and testing, and protection for the vulnerable, and it's worked. You know, they've managed to contain the spread of the virus, and are now, to their own endeavours, unlocking. You look at the example on the other side, the three sort of right-wing populist countries, Brazil, America, and the UK, have got the three worst figures. And that has become, you know, by a lot of mixed messaging and almost fake bravado at the start, the likes of Trump saying, you know, first he was going back saying it wasn't going to spread properly, then he's saying he was testing more than everyone else. And in Brazil, minimal response. The UK, muddled response. And I think it sort of explodes the myth that those type of administrations are somehow competent. They're not. They're based on myths. They're based on populist rhetoric, but with no substance in terms of detail, understanding of the problems in front of them, and effective grown-up solutions to respond to something. And it's interesting because all three of those countries have adopted similar approaches, and inevitably with tragic results.
Yeah, it turned out to be money of the people in the end of the day.
Yeah. Unnecessary lives have been lost. And it goes back to that point about late lockdowns again.
Yeah, definitely. And well, turning back to these days, we see also rise on George Floyd's death, and the so-called racial problem has emerged again. And what I'm wondering is that if all these riots, it has to do only with that part, you know, with the death of awful death of George Floyd, or if there is a lot more underneath.
I think in America, you know, in terms of racial issues, racial inequality, the sort of tinderbox that's waiting to go off has been there for decades. You know, police brutality to that sort of degree, combined with a lot of economic uncertainty at the moment based on what's happening with the virus. In America, I was reading recently that they've gone up from, you know, 8-9 million unemployed to around 40 million. That creates obviously its own problems in terms of people who feel disenfranchised, scared, worried, angry. And the same thing is that when there's economic crisis, you combine it with a health crisis as well, it's caused the economic crisis. you are creating, by the nature of it, tension. And then you've also got the racial issue in terms of, you know, ethnic minorities coming quite often living in disadvantaged communities that have been largely forgotten about in many parts of America. And then obviously the symbolism of that appalling police brutality that everyone's seen. There's no other side on this. There's no what about it. It's there. And so I think it's a combination of things. And I think moving forward, because the real economic impact of this virus will be happening over the next 1 to 2 years, that raises the risks of other aspects of civil unrest coming up because of the scale of this and the amount of people who are going to be caught up with either losing their jobs, job insecurity, or getting caught into poverty.
Yeah, but what I'm seeing, it's like this kind of protest spreads a lot also in the UK and leading to, like, you know, destroying statues and so on.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, maybe it shouldn't have been there in the first place, but they are there. So, and, you know, also the fact that, you know, Netflix, HBO's trying to block some content, isn't it, you know, kind of a lot more going on? I have this feeling that it's a lot more underneath, and in the same time, it doesn't solve the BAME problems, BAME community's problems. But
I think that's right. Yeah, sorry. I think there's a lot of issues at the moment, which you could go back a few years after the European referendum vote. There's a lot of, I would say, culture wars going on in the UK and America at the moment. So there is that whole right-wing populism aspect that has now got into power. And so in the case of, if you look at the case of Donald Trump, you know, where do you start and where do you finish? Whether it's putting walls against Mexico or banning individuals from certain Muslim countries, a history of, to put it as politely as I can, crass comments and logic, which have normally been aimed at ethnic minorities, combined with now we've got a health and economic crisis. It's like almost a perfect storm that's been created for this. I've said this before, we've got the worst leader at the worst time.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So in conclusion, what do you see in the next future? I mean, when do you expect that the UK gets out of the lockdown? Or lockdown? Do you expect another crisis, another lockdown in autumn?
I think there is evidence, obviously, that the spread of the virus is slowing, and I can see why things are slowly relaxing. I think they've obviously created numbers which aren't applicable in many other countries, to the reasons I've mentioned before. So I think that, and where we are now is, I think the lockdown will continue to be eased. So by the time we get to late summer, September, you'll have, by September, the schools should be back, businesses will be operating again. There might be elements of social distancing, and then you'll start looking at the higher footfall areas like spectator sport, inside a pub, restaurants, all beginning to open up again. The concern I've got is obviously the economic impact of this, where a lot of industries have been severely hit, in particular leisure, travel, hospitality, tourism. And that's going to take quite a while for them to come back. A lot of industries or sectors will struggle in those areas. And then the other concern is winter, when you go through natural flu cycles and colds. And that's why it's so important that the UK, by then, has mass testing, both in terms of cases, but to identify people who've had it before, and then tracing to identify communities who've been around individuals who've got it, and to separate out between coronavirus, colds, and flu, because coronavirus is not going to completely disappear. It's going to be part of our health mix. You know, it's going to be put under control when we get to a vaccine or suppression medicine. But the worry I've got is whether the UK government, even from learning all the mistakes right now, if there is another spike, will they have learned enough from those mistakes caused by themselves to make sure that it doesn't happen again? And that concerns me, whether they are able to do that.
Thank you very much, Jason, for our discussion. And well, since I live here as well, let's hope for the best.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.